I have been waiting to do a Thundercats video for a long time. And I can't say it's because I'm a lifelong fan of Thundercats the way I am of He-Man or Star Wars. I do like Thundercats. They're just not my number one, but they're definitely up there. But part of the reason is I worked a long time to try to get to work on Thundercats. And Thundercats have had a long and, well, odd history at market, especially with collector product lately. From scales, to switching back and forth with companies, to making figures that looked less or not so much less like the vintage line. Well, Thundercats has been an adventure. And behind the scenes, it was a big part of my career for a lot longer than, I guess, shows publicly, since, well, very few Thundercats toys actually got made by companies I was at the time. Or rather, was with while they could make them. I don't know. The point is, the story of getting Thundercat collectible toys and adult collector toys to market is a really interesting one, and I was involved for years on what became only like 7 figures from Mattel at the very end. But the amount of work that went into this was just, well, borderline insane, because it was like a decade of work. It was a long and twisted road trying to get the license to do collector scale, and how we got to do it and how we stopped doing it so quickly is an interesting story. Alright, so part of the story starts off with the 2011 relaunch of the brand, where there were actually 2 major brands that were being relaunched for kids, and to some part collectors. The first being Thundercats, and the second being Voltron. Both brands were heavily looked at by Mattel, and there was debate about which one to go after. But this was not the only time that Mattel actually went after the Thundercats license. Years before, we're talking like 2007, 2008, there was a major initiative to do a Thundercats line at Mattel. In fact, I remember Design did these really kick-ass t-shirts that was the Mattel gear logo with the Thundercats head inside that had down the sleeve Team Thundercats on it. This was way before I was in the design group, or rather the boys' marketing group, so I was very jealous of these t-shirts that they all got. Alright, so when it came time to looking at which brand to go after, Thundercats or Voltron, well, part of it was feeling a little burned from not getting Thundercats the first time back in 2007, but another reason that Voltron was looked at over Thundercats as the one to actually acquire was because Thundercats is very similar to a brand Mattel already had, that being He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. Sure, they're not exactly the same, but they're both barbarian, warrior, magical sword, type properties with, human, animal creatures that battle each other, versus something like Voltron is a giant, space robot that combines and defends the galaxy. So, thematically, very different properties. Ironic, though, that neither Thundercats nor Voltron really got a fair shake of the stick at Mattel, and both were almost cursed with extremely limited releases, but for very different reasons. And again, it makes quite an interesting tale of how both brands related to each other and, in the end, wound up really not being a success. Most of the Voltron product that was aimed at kids only got shown once at San Diego Comic-Con, but never got released because the show didn't do well. And when the show doesn't do well, when the content underperforms, retailers pull out. That's the number one reason why you don't see a brand going to retail. Thundercats, on the other hand, did make it to market, but not from Mattel. It went to Bandai. When Mattel took Voltron, or chose Voltron as, between the two, well, Bandai scooped up Thundercats. And Bandai did a great job, I thought, on this line. It was very accurate to the show, very kid-friendly. They had vehicles, they had figures, deluxe figures, playsets, the whole 9 yards, role-play, everything that should be a very successful boys' toy line. Unfortunately, much like Voltron, the entertainment was not that popular. It was more popular among adults than it was kids. I'm not saying it wasn't good. I mean, I enjoyed both the Voltron and the Thundercats 2011 shows. But the vast majority of the, toy-buying public, shall we say, were kind of out. And as cool as the show was, and as cool as the toys were, they were basically not going to make it long-term. And in addition to doing the kid product, Bandai did double down on doing collector nostalgia product, very similar to what Mattel had been doing at Matty Collector with brands like DC and Masters of the Universe, by doing Thundercats Classics. Which, of course, when I saw this, I was like, oh, great, somebody's doing exactly what I wanted to do with the brand. Awesome, I'm out. And then I saw them. I was like, what the what? They're too big. They're too tall. They're huge. They don't fit in with anything. Yep, Bandai's collector scale figures were 8 inches, making them a good 2 inches too big to fit with really anything else in my collection. Luckily, Thundercats is owned by Warner Brothers, so I already had a relationship with them, and I asked the Warner Brothers crew at a meeting once what was up with these giant Thundercat toys, and they said, oh, Bandai wanted to do them in the same scale as the vintage line. They figured since the vintage line was 8-inch, that's what collectors would want. And I was like, no, that's not how it works. They want universal scale. Everybody wants things to fit. It's not a one-off. But unfortunately, the ship had sailed. I sort of expressed my thoughts, and Warner Brothers shook their head. I was like, oh, that's really interesting. We'll pass that on to Bandai. I'm not saying that my response was what caused Bandai to then reissue Lion-O and Mumra in a slightly smaller 6-inch scale, but they did. But it was kind of like too little too late. Once you have your foot out the door, it's really hard to backtrack and put something out that's a different scale or sort of 80% the same but slightly different to market. So even though Lion-O was scaled down to 6-inch for the second wave, it was just too little too late. It wasn't going to be possible to continue the line, especially because retail was out on the main planogram, which was dedicated to the content, to the kid show. With the kid show bombing, well, you need a kid show to have a collector line as an adjacent SKU in the planogram. It sort of carries it along like a tugboat. Think of it like that. Like the planogram is the main boat, and the collector line is being hauled out by the main line. So without a main line, yeah. So Bandai was a little too late on getting a Thundercats line out for collectors, simply because the content didn't do well and their first attempt was the wrong scale. So as cool as it was to see what Thundercats could look like for a collector line, I figured, well, that's it. The story's over. We're never going to get to do, Mattel Thundercats classics. But there was the opportunity to do the waiting game. You see, Bandai had exclusive rights to Thundercats, and they had it for 3 years. So, basically, all we had to do was wait out the contract. Bandai wasn't going to renew the contract since the show underperformed and the collector line underperformed, so they had no interest in renewing. But they couldn't just cancel the contract. So, we had to essentially sit there for 3 years with no Thundercats product from anyone while we waited for the rights to free up so that we could add them to the Matty Collector portfolio. And when we could, I was overjoyed. We had worked so hard to get the Thundercats license for collector figures, and I knew that Matty Collector could handle it without entertainment because it's sold directly online, so it doesn't have to be dependent on retail in order to have a planogram within an adjacent collector SKU. It was really just about running out the clock and waiting for Bandai's rights to end. And sort of, at midnight, whatever day it ended, we swooped in, made a pitch to Warner Brothers and said, okay, now that Bandai's officially not making Thundercats toys anymore, we want to do it. And we want to do Thundercats Classic, just like we do Masters of the Universe Classic, Ghostbusters, DC, and have a really awesome 6-inch universe that can all live together. And of course, Warner Brothers was very excited that we were so passionate about this. I mean, we had been working 5 years, I think, on trying to get a Thundercats license going. Now, while originally, obviously, we just put together a quick year one plano, or rather B-sheet, we actually mapped the line out for over half a decade. I think it was a good 6 years that we figured out, or 5 years, which included everything from main releases to San Diego Comic-Con items, to add-on items, holiday items, even adding up to a playset, just like we'd done with Castle Grayskull on the Masters of the Universe line. Essentially, once you establish kind of a footprint or a method of producing a collector line, it's very easy to cut and paste that template to another brand, because you can prove, it already worked well on this brand. In the case of He-Man, we can apply the same structure to Thundercats. So we worked very carefully plotting out the entire line for, 5 or 6 years, and finding ways to make sure each year had a good representation from all the different factions. So we didn't burn through characters too quickly. We wanted to go out with some really, hot A-list characters, but the idea was to do very much like what we did with Motu Classics and have some surprise and delight items, like our first Comic-Con set. But, unfortunately, that all fell apart. And what would have been a surprise and delight Comic-Con item turned out to be the last Mattel Thundercats item, which made it a lot more bizarre than surprise and delight. So, when Mattel came to Comic-Con in 2015, this was right after I left the company for an opportunity with Jax, the Matty-Palooza panel was presented by Mark Morse here. Now, Mark is an awesome guy. I got to work with him for years. He was actually a big Hot Wheels guy for years and years, and he was a director at Mattel. When he gave the presentation, I think he may have given a little bit of the impression that he was the new brand manager over Matty Collector, which wasn't exactly so. Mark was the director over all of Boys, so he would have been my boss, if you will. He was in charge of the whole portfolio, WWE, Batman, Max Steel, whatever else, Naruto. I don't even remember what else was happening. Probably not Naruto at that point, but you get what I'm saying. He was not focused solely on Matty Collector the way I was. He was over the entertainment and games group at the end there on the right, overseeing lots of properties with different brand managers under him on individuals. Matty Collector, unfortunately, was too small to have its own brand manager. Now, Kim here, who many of you may know as Skeletor's love child on the boards, because she was a huge Skeletor fan, I was very grateful to have her on the team, but she was also she was a temp. She wasn't a full-time Mattel employee. She was brought in just to help with the logistics of making sure the work got done and product got from the port to where it needed to be. She was not a toy designer or a marketing manager by background. So Mattel kind of left this huge amount of workload on Kim, which I felt terrible for her because, not that she wasn't qualified to do this, but it was way more work than one person could do. And one of the problems is on a brand like Matty Collector, you don't get any internal recognition. Meaning, if you do really well on Barbie at Mattel, for example, you're going to get fireworks and cake and balloons and all sorts of things. People are going to congratulate you. There's going to be giant plaques in the lobby saying Barbie did something great this year and it's all because of, XX team. Let's celebrate them. Not so much with Matty Collector. With Matty Collector, you were basically lucky to get an off-brand cake and maybe a few scraps. And it was more so people would say, wait, are we still making He-Man toys? No, I'm not making that up. So combine that with the fact that there were very, very angry fans that wrote some very not nice letters to the people brand managing Matty Collector, did not exactly make it a brand that people were jumping to work on. So it kind of fell to Kim to carry the entire ball, and like I said, she was a temp. She wasn't even a full-time employee. So when she left the company about 4 or 5 months later, that meant nobody was running Matty Collector. Mark had his own responsibilities as a director overseeing everything, so the first 4 figures or 5 figures that could be created was basically about it because there was no one left to work on the brand. It wasn't an official brand on the books, it was just something I was doing in my spare time. So when Super 7 came along and said, well, we'll take over both Masters of the Universe Classics and Thundercats Classics from you, Mattel, I could understand completely why Mattel jumped at the situation and said, great! It makes so much more sense for a company like Super 7 to be producing these figures. They're smaller, they're faster, and they're catering just to the adult collector. Mattel is there to sell die-cast cars and blonde brunette dolls, to the masses. Super 7 is there to do creative adult collector executions. So it's great to see that a company like Super 7 was able to get both Thundercats and Masters of the Universe Classics, or at least for a limited time before Mattel took it back. I mean, what Super 7 has done with Thundercats is beyond what I ever hoped to. Between things like the Thunder Tank and all of the mutants, the sculpts, the original tooling, they've done some amazing, amazing stuff. And I'm so glad because, like I said, I worked for years trying to get this line to happen, and I'm just so glad to see it happen by some company, somehow, some way, to finally have Thundercat 6-inch figures. I hope you enjoyed this video and it clarified some of the backstory of what happened with Thundercats at Mattel. If you have any other questions, let me know in the comments below. I always comment back. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.